Everyone was told not to adopt this horse. He was too wild, too dangerous, too broken. But one man didn't listen. He saw something in the stallion no one else could, something worth saving. What happens when a forgotten cowboy takes on an untamable force, risking everything to prove that second chances aren't just for people? And when the town turns against him, can he fight for a horse no one believes in before it's too late? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the auction yard as Wade Calloway leaned against the weathered fence, his worn cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. His calloused hands gripped the rough wood as he watched the scene unfold before him. Inside the corral, chaos erupted. A magnificent white stallion, his coat marked with old scars, reared up on his hind legs, sending 3 ranch hands scrambling for safety. The horse's muscles rippled beneath his hide as he kicked out, his hooves striking the metal panels with a resounding clang. "Watch out!" someone yelled as the stallion charged toward another handler who barely made it over the fence in time. Wade didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the horse, taking in every movement, every reaction. Where others saw fury, he noticed the way the stallion's ears flattened against his head when anyone got too close, the wild darting of his eyes searching for escape. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. "Now, folks, I need to be clear about this one. This stallion's got a history. Attacked 3 handlers at his last place and put Hank Brewster's prize horse out of commission for good in a fight. He's dangerous, plain and simple." A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Wade glanced around at the other ranchers, seeing heads shake and arms crossed firmly over chests. No one was going to touch this horse. "Starting bid at $500, the auctioneer called out half-heartedly. "Anyone? Anyone at all?" Wade's arm rose slowly but deliberately into the air. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Whispers rippled through the gathered ranchers. Someone laughed nervously. Wade kept his eyes forward, ignoring them all. "Wade Calloway, have you lost your mind?" The sharp voice cut through the murmurs. Hank Brewster pushed his way through the crowd, his face red with anger. "That devil nearly killed my best breeding stallion. He's not worth the bullet it would take to put him down." Wade turned slowly to face Hank, his voice quiet but firm. "That's not your decision anymore, is it?" "You're making a mistake, Calloway," Hank spat. "That horse'll break you worse than that bull did." Wade's old rodeo injury twinged at the mention, but he didn't react. He kept his gaze steady on Hank as the auctioneer's voice rang out. "Sold!" To Wade Calloway for $500. The sound of metal striking metal drew everyone's attention back to the corral. It took 6 men with long poles to herd the stallion into the loading chute. The horse fought every step, his white coat now dark with sweat. As they finally managed to close him into Wade's old trailer, the stallion turned his head. For the first time, his eyes met Wade's. They were dark, fierce, and unblinking, not the eyes of a mindless killer, but of a fighter who wouldn't submit. Wade saw his own reflection in those eyes, 2 stubborn souls refusing to accept defeat. The stallion struck the trailer wall again, the sound echoing across the now quiet auction yard. Hours later, the late afternoon sun hung low on the horizon as Wade's truck pulled up to his ranch's corral. The trailer rattled behind him, Ghost's angry kicks punctuating every moment of the drive home. Wade parked carefully, making sure the trailer door lined up with the corral gate. His boots crunched on the gravel as he climbed down from the cab, each step accompanied by a familiar ache in his hip. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional snort and thud from inside the trailer. No other buildings dotted the landscape, just endless Wyoming prairie stretching toward distant mountains. Wade took his time securing the corral gate, double-checking the heavy wooden posts and metal panels. Ghost wouldn't find any weak spots here. Finally, he approached the trailer and unlatched the door, stepping back without a word. The door swung open with a creak. Inside, Ghost's white coat gleamed in the shadows, his muscles tense and ready. But the stallion didn't move. He stood rigid, nostrils flaring as he took in the unfamiliar sense of his new home. Wade didn't reach for any of the usual tools hanging on the fence. No ropes, no whips, no chains. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, watching. Minutes ticked by. Ghost pawed at the trailer floor, snorting his displeasure. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Wade shifted his weight to his good leg, but otherwise remained still. An hour passed. The evening air grew cooler, carrying the sweet scent of sage. Wade leaned against a fence post, crossing his arms over his chest. His hip was screaming at him, but he ignored it. Some things were worth the pain. "Ain't no one forcing you, boy," he finally whispered, his voice barely carrying across the space between them. "You come out when you're ready." Ghost's ears swiveled forward at the sound. He took one tentative step toward the door, then froze. Another long moment passed before he finally moved again, placing one hoof carefully on the ground outside the trailer. The instant all four hooves touched dirt, Ghost exploded into motion. He tore around the corral, kicking up clouds of dust, testing every inch of the fence. His hooves thundered against the earth as he ran, his white mane flying like a banner behind him. Wade watched it all without moving, noting how the stallion checked each corner, each post, looking for weakness. The old rodeo injury in his hip throbbed with every beat of Ghost's hooves, but he stayed until the horse had run himself out. Later that evening, Wade sat at his kitchen table, a plate of beans and cornbread growing cold in front of him. Through the window, he could see Ghost in the corral, his white coat almost glowing under the rising moon. The stallion hadn't stopped moving entirely, still pacing, still watching, still untrusting. When the dishes were done and the kitchen light turned off, Wade made his way to the front porch. His limp was more pronounced now, the day's events taking their toll. The night air was crisp and clear, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant cry of a coyote. "You're safe now?" Wade whispered into the darkness. In the corral, Ghost's ear flicked toward the sound, but the stallion remained where he was, a pale shadow under the stars. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when the sound of tires on gravel broke the dawn silence. Wade looked up from where he'd been checking Ghost's water trough, his weathered face tightening at the sight of an unfamiliar black sedan winding up the ranch road. The car looked out of place against the backdrop of worn fence posts and sun-bleached barnwood. It pulled to a stop in a cloud of dust, and out stepped Mia Calloway, looking every bit the corporate success story in her crisp blazer and designer boots that had clearly never seen ranch work. Wade's chest tightened. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she'd last come home. "Dad," she said, the word falling flat between them as she surveyed the property. Her eyes traced the peeling paint on the barn, the sagging roof of the storage shed, and the empty pastures that had once held prize horses. "Mia." Wade didn't move from his spot by the corral. "Didn't know you were coming." "Clearly." Her lips pressed into a thin line as she took in more of the ranch's decline. Then her gaze landed on Ghost, who stood alert in the corral, his white coat almost blinding in the morning sun. Her expression darkened. "Tell me you didn't buy that damn horse." Wade shifted his weight, absently rubbing his aching hip. He needed a home. "A home?" Mia's voice rose sharply. This place can barely keep standing, and you're taking in dangerous strays?" She gestured at the corral. "I heard about this horse at the feed store. Everyone's talking about how he nearly killed Hank Brewster's prize stallion." Wade leaned against the fence, unmoved by her anger. "He needed a home," he repeated simply. "You're impossible." Mia threw up her hands. "You're still chasing ghosts, aren't you? Still trying to prove you're the same man who won those rodeo championships?" She pointed at his bad hip. "When are you going to accept that those days are over?" Wade waved her off, turning his attention back to Ghost. He'd had enough fights over the years to know when one wasn't worth having. The dismissal only fueled Mia's frustration, but before she could speak again, Ghost suddenly reared up in the corral. His hooves sliced through the air as he let out a sharp whinny, his eyes fixed on Mia's car. The strange vehicle seemed to unsettle him, and his nostrils flared as he came back down, pawing at the ground. The display silenced both father and daughter. They watched as Ghost pranced nervously, his muscles taut under his white coat, ready to explode into movement at any moment. Mia's jaw clenched. Without another word, she turned and stormed toward the house, her boots clicking against the wooden porch steps before the screen door slammed behind her. Wade remained at the fence, his eyes meeting Ghost's. The stallion's gaze was sharp and wary, mirroring something Wade felt in his own heart, a stubborn unwillingness to trust, to let anyone too close. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror plenty of times over the years. Next day, the rhythmic thunder of hooves jolted Mia awake. She blinked against the early morning light streaming through the guest room window, momentarily disoriented by the familiar yet strange surroundings of her childhood home. The pounding continued, accompanied by the soft jingle of metal and the scuff of boots on dirt. Pushing aside the faded curtains, she saw Wade in the corral with Ghost. Her father held a rope loosely in his calloused hands, his stance careful but determined. Ghost circled the fence line, his white coat gleaming with sweat, ears pinned flat against his head. Mia threw on her clothes and headed outside, the screen door creaking behind her. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dust and sage. She crossed her arms, watching from the porch as Wade attempted to work with the stallion. He moved the way he'd done thousands of times before with other horses. Slow, measured steps forward, then back. Approach and retreat. A dance every ranch kid learned from the time they could walk. But Ghost wasn't having any of it. The stallion's muscles bunched beneath his coat. Without warning, he spun and lashed out with his back legs. Wade jerked backward, but not quite fast enough. Ghost's hooves whistled past his shoulder, missing by inches. Wade stumbled, his bad hip betraying him, and fell against the fence. His hand clutched at his ribs where he'd hit the rail. "Dad!" Mia rushed forward, her heart pounding. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Ghost snorted and pranced on the far side of the corral, head high, nostrils flaring. Wade pushed himself upright, grimacing but determined. "That's enough," Mia said, reaching the fence. "That thing is going to kill you, and for what? Proving you've still got it?" Wade didn't respond. He just rubbed his ribs, caught his breath, and took a step back toward Ghost. His face was set with the same stubborn expression Mia remembered from her childhood, the one that meant no amount of arguing would change his mind. Frustration bubbled up inside her. She'd seen enough. With an exasperated huff, she turned and marched back to the house, letting the screen door slam behind her with a satisfying bang. Through the window, she watched as Wade remained in place, standing quietly by the corral, while Ghost stared back, both of them locked in their silent standoff as the shadows lengthened across the yard. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Wade made his way outside, each step a reminder of yesterday's bruises. His hip ached more than usual, and his ribs protested with every breath. But the familiar morning sounds of birds chirping and horses nickering drew him forward like they had every day for the past 40 years. He paused when he saw Mia already standing by the corral, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She wore the same worried frown he remembered from when she was little, watching him head out to another rodeo. Ghost paced the fence line, his white coat catching the early light. "You're up early," Wade said, coming to stand beside her. "Couldn't sleep." Mia's eyes followed Ghost's movements. "Keep thinking about yesterday." Wade leaned against the fence post, trying to hide his wince. "Ain't nothing to think about." "Why do you care so much about this horse?" Mia turned to face him, her voice tight with frustration. "What's so special about him that you're willing to risk getting yourself killed?" Wade shrugged, his weathered face giving away nothing. "Because I ain't giving up on him." Before Mia could argue, Wade pushed off the post and headed for the corral gate. His movements were stiff but determined as he stepped inside. Ghost's ears swiveled forward, tracking Wade's every move. "Easy now," Wade whispered, taking slow, careful steps. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Ghost's muscles tensed. Wade saw it coming a split second before it happened, the stallion's charge, hooves thundering against the dirt. Wade dove to the side, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through his ribs. "Dad!" Mia vaulted over the fence, rushing to help him up. Wade waved her off, struggling to his feet on his own. "I'm fine." Ghost wheeled around the corral, kicking up clouds of dust, his white coat now dirty and damp with sweat. "Damn it, Dad! This isn't about proving something." Mia's voice cracked with emotion. Wade didn't answer. He just leaned against the fence, catching his breath as he watched Ghost rear and stomp, wild and untamed. The stallion's eyes were wide with the fear that no amount of force could touch. Mia stood there for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides. Then she turned and walked back to the house. This time, there was no angry slam of the screen door, just a quiet click that somehow felt heavier than any bang. In the corral, Wade pressed a hand to his throbbing ribs, watching Ghost through the settling dust. Neither of them had won today, but Wade wasn't done trying. Not by a long shot. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight when Wade jerked awake in his armchair. Through the window, he heard the familiar sound of hooves striking dirt. Ghost was restless again. Wade grabbed his worn leather jacket from the hook by the door, his movements careful to avoid waking Mia upstairs. The night air hit his face with a crisp chill as he stepped onto the porch. Moonlight bathed the ranch in silver, casting long shadows across the yard. Ghost's white coat seemed to glow as he paced the corral, his muscled form tense and alert. Wade made his way over, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The only other sounds were the steady chirp of crickets and the whisper of wind through the grass. He leaned against the fence post, watching the stallion's agitated movements. Without really meaning to, Wade found himself speaking. His voice was quiet, barely louder than the breeze. "First time I got thrown was at the Sterling County Rodeo," he whispered. "Broke my collarbone. Doc said I should quit right then." He let out a low chuckle. "Didn't listen, of course." Ghost's ears swiveled toward Wade's voice, his pacing slowing. "Last ride was different, though." Wade's voice grew softer. "Hip wasn't right after that one. Never has been." He shifted his weight, feeling the familiar ache. "Funny how folks look at you different after something like that. Like you're made of glass. Like you can't do nothing anymore." Ghost had stopped moving entirely now, his head turned toward Wade, ears pricked forward. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, the stallion seemed to be truly listening. Wade pushed off from the fence post and took a careful step forward. He kept talking, his whispered words floating on the night air. "They were gonna put you down, you know. Said you were too wild, too dangerous." Another step. Maybe we're both trying to prove something. Ghost stood perfectly still, his breathing steady, eyes fixed on Wade. There was no tension in his posture now, no sign of the usual fight or fear. Wade moved closer until he stood right beside the magnificent animal. They stayed like that, man and horse, sharing the quiet night. Wade didn't reach out to touch him. It wasn't time for that yet. But something had changed. The stallion wasn't just tolerating his presence anymore. He was thinking, considering, maybe even understanding. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Mia stepped onto the front porch, coffee mug in hand. She noticed right away how Wade moved differently, each step more careful, his limp more pronounced. The night's chill had settled into his old injuries, making them ache worse than usual. She watched as he made his way to the corral, her fingers tightening around her mug. But something was different today. No rope hung from his shoulder, no tools in his hands. Just Wade, moving with deliberate slowness toward the fence. Ghost stood in the far corner, his white coat gleaming in the morning light. His ears flicked forward as Wade entered the corral. But he didn't rear up or charge like before. Instead, he watched, head high, nostrils flaring slightly. Wade didn't move directly toward the stallion. He began a slow walk along the fence line, keeping his movement smooth and unhurried despite the obvious stiffness in his hip. Ghost matched his pace from the opposite side of the corral, maintaining the distance between them. Mia found herself drawn closer to the railing, her coffee forgotten. The usual tension that filled the corral during these sessions was different now. Instead of a battle of wills, it felt more like a conversation. Wade wasn't trying to force Ghost into submission anymore. He was just being there, moving with him, understanding him. The morning stretched on, and still, Mia didn't leave her spot on the porch. She watched as Wade and Ghost continued their silent dance, circling, pausing, moving together, but apart. When Ghost would stop, Wade would stop. When the stallion took a step, Wade would mirror it. No demands, no pressure, just patience. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, Ghost still hadn't let Wade touch him. But he also hadn't tried to run or fight. The stallion stood just a few feet away from Wade, both of them still, both of them waiting. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The peaceful morning shattered with the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A cloud of dust followed Hank Brewster's pickup as it rolled to a stop in front of the ranch house. Wade straightened up from where he'd been leaning against the corral fence, his face hardening as Hank stepped out of his truck. Ghost's ears pinned back at the newcomer, and he moved to the far end of the corral, his muscles tense and ready. "Wade," Hank called out, his boots hitting the dirt with authority. "We need to talk." Wade didn't move from his spot. "Then talk." Hank strode forward, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Filed a complaint with the town council yesterday. That animal's a menace, and folks around here won't stand for it." "He ain't hurt nobody since he got here," Wade said, his voice low and steady. "Yet." Hank's eyes narrowed. "You forget what he did to my prize stallion? Cost me thousands in vet bills, and the horse still ain't right." From her spot on the porch, Mia watched the exchange, her arms crossed. But something had shifted in her expression. The usual automatic agreement with anyone opposing her father wasn't there. "I'm making progress with him," Wade insisted, gesturing toward Ghost. "He just needs time." "Time's up, Wade." Hank thrust the paper forward. "Town's given you 1 week. Either you prove that beast is safe, or the authorities come and take him." Wade's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. He didn't even look at the paper. "You come for that horse, Hank. You're going to have to come through me." Hank snorted, shaking his head as he turned back toward his truck. "Always were too stubborn for your own good, Wade." He climbed into his pickup, the engine roaring to life. 1 week! The dust hadn't even settled from Hank's departure when Mia stepped off the porch, moving to stand beside her father. She watched him stare out at Ghost, who had begun pacing the fence line again. "You can't win a fight against the whole damn town," she said softly. Wade kept his eyes on Ghost, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ain't a fight if you don't quit." Mia looked at her father then, really looked at him. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering if what she'd always seen as pure stubbornness might be something else entirely. Maybe, just maybe, her father was right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Mia sat on the weathered porch steps, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She watched her father in the corral, noting how he favored his left side, his movements stiffer than usual. The old rodeo injuries were taking their toll, but Wade pressed on anyway, speaking softly to Ghost as he worked. The white stallion kept his distance, but something had changed. He no longer bolted at Wade's approach, instead watching with wary interest. Progress, maybe, but at what cost? Mia sighed heavily, rubbing her temples as the familiar worry and frustration battled inside her. Setting her coffee aside, she pushed herself up and walked toward the corral, arms crossed. "You're never going to get through to him like this." Wade glanced over his shoulder, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "That right?" Mia surprised herself with what came next. "Let me help." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. She quickly added, "Not because I believe in this crazy mission of yours, but you're clearly too stubborn to stop, and I'd rather not watch you get yourself killed." Wade raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting. "Look," she continued, "you can't see his reactions when you're focused on moving, but I can. If you let me watch him, I can tell you what works and what doesn't." After a moment's consideration, Wade nodded. "All right then." They spent the next hour working together, finding a rhythm they hadn't shared in years. Mia stood outside the corral, carefully observing Ghost's body language, the flick of his ears, the tension in his muscles, the slight shifts in his stance. "His ears just relaxed," she called out. "Whatever you just did, do it again." Wade repeated the gentle motion, speaking in that same soft tone. Ghost's response was subtle but unmistakable. One step forward instead of back. Just one step. But it felt like a mile. As evening settled over the ranch, Mia found herself back on the porch, arms wrapped around her knees, lost in thought. The day's events played through her mind, stirring up feelings she'd thought long buried. Wade's boots creaked on the wooden steps as he joined her. Together, they watched Ghost standing calmly by the fence, a sight that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Without looking at her, Wade spoke quietly. "I appreciate the help, kid." Mia didn't respond right away. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel the urge to walk away either. She just sat there beside her father, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Wade stood in the center of the corral, his weathered hand extended with a piece of apple resting in his palm. Mia leaned against the fence, her skepticism evident in the tight line of her mouth. She'd seen her father try this before with other horses, but Ghost was different. The white stallion stood a few yards away, his muscles tense and ready to bolt. His ears flicked back and forth, nostrils flaring as he caught the sweet scent of the apple. Wade remained perfectly still, not even seeming to breathe. "He won't take it," Mia whispered more to herself than to Wade. But even as she spoke, she noticed Ghost's slight shift in posture. The stallion's head lowered just a fraction, his eyes fixed on the treat. Minutes stretched by like hours. Wade's arm must have been aching, but he didn't waver. Ghost took one tentative step forward, then another. His hooves made soft sounds in the dirt as he inched closer, fighting against years of learned distrust. Mia found herself gripping the fence tighter, her heart beating faster as Ghost drew near to Wade. The stallion's breath came in short, nervous puffs, visible in the cool morning air. When Ghost was finally within reach, he stretched his neck out, lips quivering. Mia held her breath. Wade remained statue still, his eyes soft, his presence calm and steady. In one swift motion, Ghost snatched the apple from Wade's palm and retreated a few steps. But he didn't run to the far end of the corral as he usually did. Instead, he stood there, crunching the apple, his eyes never leaving Wade. The moment hung in the air like magic. Wade's face broke into a wide grin as he turned to Mia. "Told ya." Mia let out the breath she'd been holding, shaking her head in disbelief. Something had shifted, not just with Ghost, but in the air between her and her father. As the day wore on, Ghost showed other small changes. He stayed closer to the fence, no longer retreating to the far corners. When evening painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mia stood beside her father, arms crossed, but without their usual defensive tension. "Maybe you were right," she admitted quietly. Wade's chuckle was warm and familiar. "Say it a little louder. I don't think the horse heard you." Mia rolled her eyes, but she couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face, the first real one she'd shared with her father in years. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning peace. A black SUV pulled up beside Hank Brewster's familiar truck, and Wade's jaw tightened as he recognized Mark Thompson, the town's code enforcement officer, stepping out with a manila folder tucked under his arm. Hank emerged from his truck with a smug look that made Wade's blood boil. The two men approached the fence where Wade and Mia stood, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "Mr. Calloway," Mark said, his voice carrying the forced politeness of someone delivering bad news. "We need to discuss the situation with your stallion." Hank cut straight to the point. "Show us how safe this animal is, Wade." "Prove he's not a threat." Wade's hands gripped the fence rail tighter. "He ain't some circus act, Hank. You don't get to demand a show." Mark cleared his throat and pulled a document from his folder. "I'm afraid Mr. Brewster isn't asking. We have concerns about public safety and, well," he held out the paper. "The sheriff has already signed the removal order." Mia snatched the document before Wade could react. Her eyes scanned the page, widening slightly. 4 days? That's all you're giving him? "More than generous considering the animal's history," Hank said. "Unless you can prove he's safe, Ghost will be removed on Monday morning." Mia watched the color drain from her father's face. She'd been away from town so long, she'd forgotten how much pull Hank had with the local officials, how easily he could make things happen with a few words in the right ears. "This is ridiculous," she protested. "You can't just—" "We can, and we will," Hank interrupted. "Your daddy's had his chance to play horse whisperer. Time's up." Wade's fists clenched at his sides. Without a word, he turned and strode away from the fence, his limp more pronounced with each angry step. Mia hurried after him, leaving Hank and Mark standing by the fence. "Dad, wait!" She caught up to him near the barn. "You can't just fight your way out of this." Wade stopped, his shoulders tense. When he turned to face her, his voice was steady despite the anger in his eyes. "Then I'll show 'em." In the corral, Ghost picked up on the tension. He paced back and forth, his hooves beating an anxious rhythm in the dirt. His ears flicked rapidly, catching every raised voice, every angry tone. Wade walked to the fence, watching the stallion's agitated movements. His voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "They don't get to decide your story, boy. You do." The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Mia stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand. She stopped short, nearly spilling the hot liquid, when she saw Wade by the corral, adjusting an old leather saddle on the fence rail. Her heart dropped. "Number no way!" She marched across the yard, gravel crunching under her boots. "You're not trying to ride him?" Wade didn't look up from his work, just shrugged as he checked the saddle's cinch. "Gotta prove he ain't dangerous." "You'll get yourself killed." Mia's voice cracked with frustration and fear. She set her mug down hard on the fence post. "This is exactly the kind of stupid stunt that got you hurt in the first place." Wade ignored her protest, gathering up a worn wool blanket. He moved toward the corral gate with the same quiet patience he'd shown all week. Ghost watched him from the far corner, ears pricked forward with interest. Stepping into the corral, Wade kept his movements slow and deliberate. He whispered something too soft for Mia to hear, and to her amazement, Ghost didn't retreat. The stallion stood his ground as Wade approached, the blanket draped over his arm. With gentle movements, Wade lifted the blanket. Ghost flinched when it touched his back, but he didn't bolt, didn't kick, just shifted his weight nervously as the fabric settled across his spine. "How?" Mia whispered, her anger momentarily forgotten in her surprise. Wade's weather-worn face broke into a slight smirk. "You gotta speak his language." He kept his voice low, soothing. "Ain't about forcing him. It's about listening." For the next hour, Wade worked with quiet determination. He never rushed, never pushed. When Ghost seemed uncertain, Wade would step back, give him space, then try again. The blanket would stay on a little longer each time. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Ghost stood quietly now. The blanket settled firmly on his back. He'd stopped flinching at its touch, stopped trying to shake it off. Mia leaned against the fence, arms crossed tight across her chest. She watched as her father patted Ghost's neck, the first real touch the horse had allowed. It wasn't much, just a blanket on a horse's back. But seeing the wild stallion standing there, calm and trusting, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, her father wasn't as crazy as she'd thought. The morning air bit with unexpected sharpness as Wade stepped out onto his front porch, coffee mug warming his weathered hands. The sun hadn't quite broken over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Something felt off. His eyes went straight to the corral, where Ghost usually waited by the fence. But the stallion wasn't there. Instead, he was at the far end, pacing back and forth like a caged tiger. His ears were pinned flat against his head, muscles rippling with tension beneath his silver coat. Wade set his coffee down, frowning. A week's worth of progress seemed to have vanished overnight. Ghost's movements were jerky, agitated, nothing like the calm creature who'd let Wade touch him yesterday. The screen door creaked behind him. Mia stepped out, still in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Dad?" She paused, following his gaze. "What's wrong with him?" Wade didn't answer right away. He studied Ghost's behavior, the way the horse kept glancing toward the eastern fence line, how his nostrils flared with each breath. Something had spooked him bad. Mia walked to the edge of the porch, squinting in the dim light. Suddenly she pointed. "Look!" Fresh tire tracks cut through the morning dew near the fence, the grass crushed in twin paths. Wade's jaw clenched. Hank. The name came out like a curse. Only one person would sneak around his property at night, trying to stir up trouble. Moving slowly, Wade approached the corral. Ghost's eyes locked onto him, but there was no recognition in them. only wild fear. "Easy, boy," Wade whispered, using the same gentle tone that had worked before. "It's just me." But Ghost wasn't having it. The moment Wade got within 10 feet, the stallion exploded into motion. His powerful hooves slammed against the dirt, sending clods flying. He reared up, teeth bared, every inch the untamable creature he'd been when Wade first brought him home. Wade stumbled back, his old injuries protesting the sudden movement. His ribs ached where Ghost had kicked him days ago. All their careful progress, all those quiet moments of trust, gone in a single night. He made his way back to the fence, leaning heavily against the wooden rails. Beside him, Mia watched with worried eyes. The morning silence stretched between them, broken only by Ghost's restless movements. "You still think you can fix him?" Mia finally asked, her voice soft with something that might have been concern. Wade watched the stallion pace, remembering how close they'd come to breakthrough. He let out a long breath, feeling every year of his age. "I don't know." The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street as Wade and Mia loaded bags of feed into their truck. Wade's movements were careful, his ribs still sore from the morning's incident with Ghost. The feed store's bell jingled as they stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, and there he was, Hank Brewster, leaning against a post, with a self-satisfied smile on his face. "Heard your horse ain't doing so good," Hank said, arms crossed over his chest. His boots were caked with fresh mud despite the dry weather they'd been having. Wade's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Years of rodeo had taught him how to hide pain, both physical and otherwise. But Mia wasn't as practiced at holding back. She stepped forward, her eyes sharp as cut glass. "Did you come onto our property last night?" Her voice carried across the quiet street, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Hank's smile didn't waver. He straightened up, towering over Mia, but she didn't back down. Instead of answering her question, he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Clock's ticking, Calloway. I suggest you start thinking about a new plan." Wade could feel the tension radiating off his daughter, could see her hands balling into fists at her sides. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Let's go," she said, though her eyes never left Hank's face. They turned away, boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk. Wade could feel Hank's stare boring into his back, could hear the weight of his words echoing in his mind. The drive home was quiet, the truck bouncing over familiar dirt roads. The sun had set by the time they finished unloading the feed, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Wade settled onto the porch steps, his body aching from the day's work. In the corral, Ghost stood like a silver statue in the growing darkness, his muscles still tense, ears still alert for unseen threats. Mia sat down beside him, closer than she had in years. Her voice was different too, softer, without its usual edge. "What if you can't fix this?" Wade took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. "Then I go down trying." The morning sun crept across the corral as Wade settled onto an overturned bucket near the fence. His muscles ached from yesterday's confrontation, but he ignored the pain. Ghost stood in the far corner, head high, nostrils flaring at every small movement. "It's just you and me, boy," Wade whispered, his voice barely carrying on the gentle breeze. "Ain't nobody here to hurt you." From the porch, Mia watched, coffee cup warming her hands. Her eyes narrowed as she studied her father's patience, so different from the stubborn force she remembered from her childhood. Hours ticked by. Wade didn't move, didn't try to approach. He just kept talking, his voice low and steady, sharing stories about old rodeo days and quiet mornings on the ranch. Ghost paced, his hooves marking circles in the dirt, but he didn't bolt when Wade shifted his weight or cleared his throat. The sun climbed higher, and Mia brought out sandwiches, setting one next to her father without a word. He nodded his thanks, but kept his eyes on Ghost, who had started taking shorter loops around the corral. "Remember that old mare we had?" Wade asked, his words meant for Ghost, but caring to where Mia stood. "The one that wouldn't let nobody near her for months? She turned out to be the sweetest thing once she learned to trust." Finally, after what felt like forever, Ghost's pacing slowed. His ears, which had been pinned back all morning, slowly swiveled forward. He turned toward Wade, neck arched, eyes cautious but curious. Wade's breath caught in his throat, but he kept his voice steady. "That's it, boy. Nobody's going to rush you." Slowly, carefully, Wade extended his hand. Palm up, fingers relaxed. Not reaching, not grabbing, just offering. Ghost's nostrils flared as he took in Wade's scent from several feet away. Mia found herself holding her breath as Ghost took one tentative step forward, then another. The stallion's movements were careful, deliberate, ready to bolt at the slightest wrong move. But Wade remained still as stone, his hands steady in the air between them. Then it happened. Ghost stretched out his neck and pressed his velvet nose against Wade's palm. The touch was light as a feather, but it might as well have been a thunderclap for the impact it had. Mia let out a sharp breath, her eyes wide. It was the first time Ghost had willingly made contact with her father. The moment held, fragile as spun glass, before Ghost pulled back. But he didn't retreat to the far corner this time. Instead, he stayed within arm's reach, his eyes softer than they'd been since Hank's interference. That evening, the kitchen was quiet, except for the scrape of forks against plates. Wade ate his dinner with the same careful patience he'd shown all day, not saying a word about the breakthrough. Mia stirred her iced tea, the cubes clinking against the glass as she watched her father. Finally, she broke the silence. "I think you might actually be getting through to him." Wade looked up from his plate, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Told ya." The morning peace shattered with angry voices carrying across the ranch. Wade's boots hit the porch steps two at a time, with Mia close behind. Their hearts sank at the sight of Hank Brewster's truck parked near the corral, the sheriff's vehicle right beside it. Ghost paced nervously in the corral, his ears pinned back at the unfamiliar voices. Hank stood with his arms crossed, pointing accusingly at the stallion. "Time's up," Hank announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "That horse is still dangerous." Wade's jaw tightened as he limped forward, positioning himself between Hank and the corral. "You saw what happened yesterday. He's getting better." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt as the sheriff shifted his weight uncomfortably. He'd known Wade for years, had seen him rise and fall in the rodeo circuit. But Hank's influence in the town ran deep. "Listen, Wade," the sheriff started, but Hank cut him off, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an official-looking document, holding it up with a smug smile. "Got the removal order right here," Hank declared. "Signed and legal." Mia's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward. "You can't do this." Her voice cracked with anger and disbelief. "Actually, we can," Hank replied, handing the paper to the sheriff. "By sunset tonight, if that beast isn't proven safe, we're taking him." Ghost snorted in the corral, picking up on the tension. His hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as he moved, but Wade noticed he wasn't bolting like before. He was nervous, yes, but not wild. Wade looked at Ghost, studying the stallion's cautious movements. Then he turned back to the sheriff, his voice steady and determined. "Then I guess I better prove it." The morning sun painted long shadows across the ranch as Wade stepped into the corral. His boots crunched against the dirt, each step measured and deliberate. This was it, his last chance. Mia stood rigid by the fence, her knuckles white where she gripped the wooden rail. Sheriff Dawson's truck pulled up, followed by Hank's, their arrival sending a ripple of tension through the morning air. Ghost stood at the far end of the corral, his white coat gleaming in the early light. His ears swiveled toward Wade, alert but not fearful. Wade kept his movements slow, his voice barely above a whisper. "Easy now, boy." Just like before. Hank leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching with narrowed eyes. The sheriff stood beside him, his expression neutral but watchful. Wade inched closer to Ghost, keeping his voice steady and low. "That's it. Nothing to fear here." The words weren't just for Ghost. They were for himself, too. For Mia. For everyone watching. Ghost didn't bolt. He stayed still, his ears flicking back and forth at Wade's familiar whispers. Wade's heart pounded as he closed the distance between them. With movements as gentle as falling snow, he raised his hand and placed it on Ghost's neck. The stallion's muscles tensed beneath Wade's palm, but he didn't flinch away. Mia's sharp intake of breath cut through the morning silence. Even Hank's confident smirk wavered slightly. Encouraged, Wade reached for the blanket he'd left draped over the fence. He moved with the same careful patience, letting Ghost see and smell it before slowly laying it across his back. Ghost shifted his weight, adjusting to the feeling, but remained calm. His trust in Wade held firm. "Well, I'll be damned," the sheriff muttered under his breath. Wade stepped back, hands raised, giving Ghost the space to choose what happened next. The stallion stayed where he was, ears pointed forward, watching Wade with clear, steady eyes. There was still work to be done. They both knew it, but this moment spoke volumes. Sheriff Dawson nodded slowly, stroking his chin. "He's not perfect, but I've seen worse." Beside him, Hank's jaw clenched tight, his face darkening with barely contained frustration. He wasn't happy. And from the look in his eyes, this fight was far from over. Dark clouds rolled across the afternoon sky, turning the bright day into an ominous gray twilight. Wade and Mia stood on the weathered porch, watching dust devils dance across the ranch. The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass and rattling the old wind chimes. "Looks like a big one coming," Wade said, his eyes scanning the horizon. Mia nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as the temperature dropped. The first fat raindrops splattered against the dirt just as the sound of tires skidding on gravel cut through the wind. A mud-splattered truck careened into the yard, and Sam Brewster, Hank's youngest son, practically fell out of the driver's seat. His face was flushed, hair wild from the wind. "Wade!" Sam called out, stumbling toward the porch. "We need help. The storm spooked our herd. They broke through the fence line and headed straight for the river." Wade stepped forward, his expression tightening. "Your father?" "He's out there with the others, but we can't track them in this weather. The rain's washing away their tracks, and visibility's getting worse by the minute." Sam ran a hand through his wet hair, desperation clear in his voice. Thunder cracked overhead, making them all jump. Wade's eyes drifted to the corral, where Ghost stood alert, his white coat stark against the darkening sky. The stallion's ears were pricked forward, his muscles tense but ready. Mia followed her father's gaze and immediately shook her head. No way, Dad. You can't be serious." But Wade was already moving, limping quickly to grab the bridle hanging by the barn door. His movements were purposeful, determined. "Dad, you haven't even ridden him yet. This is crazy," Mia called after him, her voice nearly lost in another rumble of thunder. The rain was falling harder now, turning the ground slick. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Ghost's powerful frame. Wade approached the corral gate, bridle in hand, his eyes locked with the stallion's. "Time to see what you're really made of, boy," Wade said softly. Ghost didn't retreat to the far end of the corral like he used to. Instead, He stepped forward, meeting Wade at the gate, as if he understood the urgency of the moment. The rain hammered down in heavy sheets as Wade grabbed Ghost's mane, swinging himself onto the stallion's broad back. His old injuries protested, but adrenaline pushed the pain aside. Mia stood frozen by the fence, her knuckles white against the wood, heart thundering in her chest. Ghost shifted beneath Wade, muscles tensing at this new weight. But he didn't buck or rear. His ears flicked back, listening to Wade's quiet whispers, barely audible above the storm. The ranch hands stared, open-mouthed, as Wade settled into position. Even Sam Brewster, who'd seen plenty of skilled riders, couldn't hide his amazement. This was the horse everyone had written off as untamable, standing steady in the middle of chaos. With a gentle squeeze of his knees, Wade urged Ghost forward. The stallion responded instantly, launching into a powerful run that carried them through the gate and into the storm. The wind howled around them, rain slashing sideways against Wade's face. He could barely see through the downpour, but Ghost moved with pure instinct, hooves sure against the slick ground. Wade didn't try to control him, just guided with his knees and whispered encouragements when needed. The stallion seemed to know exactly where to go. They found the first group of scattered cattle near the riverbank, exactly where Sam had said they'd be. The animals were panicked, huddled close to the water's edge where the ground was turning treacherous. A young calf had already slipped down the muddy slope, its frightened bleats barely audible over the storm. Ghost pulled up short without any signal from Wade, his ears pricked toward the struggling calf. Wade slid off quickly, boots sinking into the mud as he made his way down the slope. The ground was dangerously slick, but he managed to reach the calf, wrapping his arms around its wet body and heaving upward. Ghost stood steady against the howling wind, providing an anchor point as Wade worked his way back up, the calf secure in his grip. Once they reached level ground, Wade set the calf down near its mother. Taking a deep breath, Wade let out a sharp whistle. Ghost's response was immediate. The stallion moved with natural precision, circling the scattered herd, pushing them away from the dangerous riverbank. His white coat flashed in the rain as he guided the cattle toward safety, working on pure instinct. Wade watched in amazement as Ghost took charge, doing what he was born to do. But there was no time to celebrate. They still had more cattle to find. The storm intensified, turning the afternoon sky an ominous dark gray. Lightning split the clouds, followed by deafening thunder that made the cattle scatter further. Wade leaned low over Ghost's neck as they pressed forward through the driving rain, searching for any remaining strays. A desperate shout cut through the storm's fury. Wade pulled Ghost up short, listening. There it was again. Someone calling for help. Through the curtain of rain, Wade spotted movement near the surging river. His heart dropped. Sam Brewster clung to a half-submerged tree branch, the floodwaters churning violently around him. The young man's face was pale with fear as the current threatened to tear him away. The thunder of hooves announced the arrival of Mia and the other riders. They pulled their horses to a stop at the riverbank, faces tight with worry. The waters had risen dramatically, turning the usually calm river into a raging torrent. "We can't reach him," one of the ranch hands shouted over the storm. "Current's too strong." Wade knew they were right. No ordinary horse would be able to fight that current. But Ghost wasn't ordinary. He squeezed his knees gently, guiding Ghost toward the water's edge. The stallion snorted, pawing at the ground uncertainly. Wade leaned forward, whispering near his ear, "You can do this, boy." Ghost's ears flicked back, listening. Then, without further hesitation, he stepped into the rushing water. The current immediately pushed against his legs, but Ghost dug in, each step careful and deliberate. His powerful muscles worked against the force of the river as he moved deeper. Dad, no. Mia's voice carried over the storm, but Wade kept his focus on Sam, who was losing his grip on the branch. Ghost fought forward, showing incredible strength as he navigated the treacherous waters. When they got close enough, Wade reached down, extending his arm toward Sam. "Let go! I've got you!" Sam released the branch, reaching desperately. Wade caught his wrist in an iron grip and hauled upward with everything he had. Sam scrambled onto Ghost's back behind Wade, gasping and shaking. Without any command from Wade, Ghost turned in the current, knowing instinctively what needed to be done. His hooves found purchase on the riverbed as he pushed against the flow, muscles straining with the effort of carrying 2 riders through the flood. The gathered crowd watched in tense silence as Ghost battled the current. Step by steady step, he made his way back to solid ground. Finally, his hooves touched the muddy bank, and he pulled them all to safety. Sam slid off Ghost's back, collapsing to his knees on solid ground, coughing and shaking. The townspeople rushed forward to help him, their faces showing a mixture of relief and disbelief. Ghost stood steady, sides heaving from the effort, but his head was held high. The same horse they had condemned as dangerous had just proved them all wrong in the most dramatic way possible. The storm's fury had passed, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the sound of dripping water and scattered breaths. Wade sat atop Ghost, both of them drenched but standing proud at the riverbank. Behind them, Sam was still catching his breath, his clothes soaked through, hands trembling from the near-death experience. Mia jumped down from her horse, boots squelching in the mud as she rushed toward them. Her eyes darted between her father and Ghost, a mix of relief and amazement on her face. The gathered crowd of ranch hands and townsfolk stood in stunned silence, their earlier judgments washed away by what they'd just witnessed. Hank Brewster stepped forward, his usual commanding presence diminished. His clothes were plastered to his body, his face pale as he looked at his son, then at the stallion he'd fought so hard to have destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ghost, the horse he'd labeled as too dangerous to live, had just saved Sam's life. The heavy silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional snort from Ghost, who stood calmly under Wade's gentle hand. The sheriff cleared his throat, breaking the spell that seemed to hold everyone in place. "I think that settles the debate," he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Heads nodded in respect, and several of the ranch hands who'd once backed Hank's campaign against Ghost now couldn't meet Wade's eyes. The tide had turned completely. Hank stood rigid, his jaw clenched tight as he processed everything. Wade held his gaze steadily, not pushing, not gloating, just waiting. The tension built until finally, Hank let out a sharp exhale. In a gesture that spoke volumes, he tipped his hat slightly toward Wade. "Guess I was wrong about that horse," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him to say. Mia watched the exchange carefully. Coming from Hank Brewster, a man who'd built his reputation on never backing down, those simple words carried the weight of surrender. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was enough. As Wade turned Ghost toward home, Mia fell into step beside them. Her boots left prints in the mud as she walked, her eyes soft as she looked up at her father. "You did it," she said quietly. Wade chuckled, reaching down to pat Ghost's wet neck. "We did it." The night settled over the ranch like a soft blanket, the air still heavy with the lingering dampness of the storm. Stars pierced through the clearing sky, dotting the darkness with pinpricks of silver light. The only sounds were the gentle drip of water from the roof and the occasional distant whinny from Ghost in his corral. Mia sat on the worn wooden porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. The events of the day played through her mind on repeat. The storm, the rescue, the way her father and Ghost had worked together as one. But more than that, she thought about all the years that had passed, all the words left unsaid between her and Wade. The screen door creaked behind her. Wade's familiar heavy footsteps crossed the porch, and he lowered himself onto the step beside her with a slight grunt. His clothes were clean and dry now, but he still moved carefully, his body no doubt feeling the toll of the day's events. They sat in companionable silence, both watching the starlit sky. The moment felt fragile somehow, like a soap bubble that might burst at the slightest disturbance. Finally, Wade cleared his throat. "I wasn't a great father." The words came out rough, like they'd been stuck in his throat for years. Mia turned to look at him, surprised. In all their arguments, in all their silences, he'd never admitted this before. Wade kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his profile outlined against the night sky. "I know why you left. I know why you stayed away. And I don't blame you." The words hit Mia like a physical force. She felt her throat tighten as years of buried emotions rose to the surface. "I never wanted to hate you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." Wade's response was simple, but heavy with understanding. Mia let out a shaky breath, feeling the tangled mess of emotions in her chest. Anger, hurt, love, hope, all of it shifting and settling into something new. This was the first time her father had ever acknowledged his mistakes, had ever shown he understood why she'd needed to leave. After a long pause that felt both heavy and healing, Mia slowly leaned her head against Wade's shoulder. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just sat there, solid and present, finally understanding that she had never needed him to be perfect. She had only ever needed him to try. The morning sun painted the ranch in soft golden light as Wade made his way to the corral. His steps were slow but steady, his body still aching from yesterday's adventure in the storm. As he approached, he stopped, struck by what he saw. Ghost stood by the fence, head raised, ears forward. The usual tension in his muscles was gone. The wariness in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a quiet certainty. Wade recognized it immediately. After all their struggles, all their battles of will, Ghost wasn't just standing in a corral anymore, he was home. Wade approached without any of his usual tools, no rope, no bridle, nothing to control or contain. Behind him, he heard the soft crunch of gravel as Mia walked up, keeping her distance but watching intently. With deliberate movements, Wade reached out, letting his hand brush over Ghost's muzzle. The stallion didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch, his breath warm against Wade's palm. Then, moving with the same careful patience he'd shown since the beginning, Wade walked to the gate. The metal creaked as he unclasped it, swinging it wide open. He stepped aside, creating a clear path to freedom. Ghost remained still, his intelligent eyes fixed on Wade. The stallion's ears flicked forward, then back, processing this new development. Mia approached slowly, her boots crunching on the gravel. "You're letting him go?" Her voice carried equal parts disbelief and concern. Wade smiled, never taking his eyes off Ghost. "I'm giving him a choice." They watched as Ghost took his first tentative steps through the gate. His hooves touched the open ground beyond the corral, and he paused, head high, nostrils flaring as he took in the vast expanse of land stretching before him. The morning breeze ruffled his mane, carrying the scent of sage and open prairie. For a moment, everything was still. Then, to Wade's quiet surprise, Ghost didn't bolt for the horizon. He didn't run for freedom. Instead, He stayed, turning his head to look back at Wade. Not because a rope held him, not because fences contained him, but because he chose to. The days melted into one another like watercolors on a canvas, each sunrise bringing subtle changes to the ranch. The whispers in town about Wade and his wild stallion gradually faded, replaced by respectful nods and friendly waves. Ghost's story had become something of a local legend, the dangerous horse who turned out to be a hero. Mia found herself settling into an unexpected rhythm. Her laptop sat unopened more often than not, work emails going unanswered for hours at a time. Instead, she spent long moments on the porch, coffee cup warming her hands as she watched the morning light spill across the land. The same views she'd once dismissed as boring now held her attention, revealing new details with each passing day. Ghost roamed freely around the ranch, but he never strayed far. Sometimes he'd disappear over a hill, only to return hours later, as if checking to make sure the ranch was still there. Wade would just smile, knowing the stallion would come back. Trust, once earned, worked both ways. One evening, as the air cooled and crickets began their nightly chorus, Wade stepped out of the barn to an unexpected sight. Mia stood beside Ghost, running a brush along his gleaming coat with sure, steady strokes. Her movements were careful but confident, and Ghost stood perfectly still, head lowered in contentment. Wade leaned against the barn door, watching his daughter work. When she finally noticed him, she paused, brush mid-stroke. "What?" A knowing smirk crossed Wade's weathered face. "Didn't think you liked horses." Mia rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. She resumed brushing, paying special attention to a spot behind Ghost's ears that made the stallion's eyes half close in pleasure. "Maybe I just didn't like the right one." The simple admission hung in the air between them, carrying weight far beyond its words. Wade nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, father and daughter stood side by side at the fence. Ghost grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check their presence. The stallion moved with an easy grace, no longer carrying the weight of his past battles. He wasn't broken or tamed. He was simply at peace. Wade felt something settle in his own chest as he watched. For years he'd been chasing Ghost, trying to recapture his rodeo glory days, trying to prove he wasn't past his prime. But standing here, in this moment, he realized he didn't need to chase anything anymore. The present was enough. Beside him, Mia stood quietly, her shoulders relaxed, her usual restlessness gone. She wasn't checking her phone or making plans to leave. She was just there, home. If you enjoyed the story of Wade and Ghost, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.